Today we're going to take a look at the ASRock G10 gaming router. Now, this is wireless AC2600. Now in the box, it's pretty minimal. You get the router itself, a USB cable that is actually used for an accessory that I'll show you in a second, this cool little fabric pouch, an Ethernet cable, a small HDMI extension cable, and then the power brick. This is a 12 volt, 3 amp power brick. Now, this is the interesting thing. This module here is a travel router. This is actually two different devices in one physical case. This is a Ethernet input, and it provides a wireless AC experience, sort of self-contained in this, and it's powered by this USB input. So this USB connection here actually powers this travel router. This, on the HDMI end, it's like, well, what does HDMI have to do with travel routing? Well, it's actually a miracast adapter. So you could plug this into a television and cast to it that way. This also is powered by this USB adapter. So you can use this as a travel router or a miracast adapter or both. So that's kind of neat. It doesn't actually mechanically connect to the router at all. This is just a convenient docking station for it. So it's like two routers for the price of one, I guess. Now the thing to look at here on the box is AC2600. What does that actually mean? Well, it has to do with how much available bandwidth there is. So when you're comparison shopping for routers, you can look at this and say, oh, it's 5 gigahertz at 1733 megabit and 2.4 gigahertz at 800 megabit. What that means, what you can derive from that, is that this is a 4x4 antenna configuration. There are 4 2.4 gigahertz antennas in here, and there are 4 5 gigahertz antennas in here. And it supports MIMO and it supports beamforming. So it will find the best antennas for talking to a particular client, and you can get up to 1733 megabit of traffic for your particular clients. A lot of other access points are 3x3, a lot of motherboards and devices are 2x2, but this particular router is in a 4x4 configuration, so I can't wait to put it to the test and see how much bandwidth we're actually going to get. At the back connection here, on the top, we've actually got two infrared LEDs. These infrared LEDs can actually be used for controlling stuff in your home theater. So this router was obviously meant to be installed in a living room, near your home theater, or near other appliances. These infrared LEDs would emit signals like your television remote control to turn your television on and off, that sort of thing. There's a mobile app that goes with this router that sort of gives you the interface to be able to do that, so that you can use your phone as a remote control, basically. And these are the infrared LEDs that actually do it. They're fixed. You can't actually plug in a cable, so you'll have to position the router such that the infrared light from this would actually be received by the infrared receiver. These are really bright LEDs, so at least in the infrared spectrum. So you may actually get into a spot where, if you cram this in a cabinet, your television might not be able to see the infrared signals, but if this is facing a wall and your television can see the wall, then there's enough reflectivity off of the wall to actually transmit the signal infrared and have the television pick it up. Here we've got two setup buttons, one for 2.4 gigahertz, one for 5 gigahertz, and then we've got 4 LAN ports and a WAN port. These are all gigabit, of course. Then we've got 2 USB 3 interfaces. This will actually let you plug in a hard drive or whatever, and you can actually serve files off of the hard drive. There's also a cloud application this comes with, so you can access your files remotely. This is a mechanical on-off switch, and then you've got your DC input and your reset jack. We're going to take a look at the web interface on the ASRock G10. Now, I haven't messed with this too much, so a lot of this is going to be a surprise for me, but I thought that would be pretty fun, sort of impromptu, and see how good of a job they've done organizing the back end, the user interface, that kind of thing, because these router interfaces, I always hesitate because the router interfaces are always a little bit sketchy or a little bit weird or a little bit, I don't know. For me, for routing, I prefer running Linux or FreeBSD or NetBSD or some variation thereof, or some distribution that's built on one of those, or building my own. I've even been known to run Cisco equipment depending on what the situation is. By default, out of the box, the thing comes with 192.168.1.1 as the default address, and the password is admin. The username and password are admin. Okay, seems pretty basic. I've got some controls here for the WAN, the router, USB interface, clients that are hooked up. I've only got this computer hooked up to it right now, so that makes sense. I can turn the lighting on and off, so if you toggle this, it's weird. I don't know why it wants me to reboot because I've changed the lighting setting, but I'll do that later. So I don't know if you can see that, but I've repositioned the router to be right here so you guys can see it. So I'm going to toggle the lighting off again. It still wants me to reboot, but it does actually disable the LED immediately. So that'll probably be fixed in a software update. It doesn't make sense that you would have to reboot the router, potentially disconnecting all of your clients if you're going to change the lighting setting. But okay, whatever. There's a thing to toggle Wi-Fi on and off. I guess if something's going on with the Wi-Fi, you could just shut it off from here, parental control, and guest networks. We're going to go straight into advanced because I like to hang out in advanced because I'm an advanced kind of guy. So here we can see our router information. We can see the hardware version, G10, firmware version 1.23. You should probably update the firmware. I'll show you how to do that in a second. Whenever you get one of these, checking for new firmware as the first step, generally, good idea. We've got the wireless 2.4 gigahertz and the wireless 5 gigahertz. Now some routers actually run the same access point name for the 2.4 and the 5 gigahertz. Sometimes this works okay, sometimes it leads to a bad experience. So a lot of manufacturers opt to have two separate networks with two separate names. If you're running a lot of commercial grade gear, like we're going to put this up against the Ubiquiti 802.11 AC 3x3 MIMO, because this is a 4x4, and I'm sort of curious to see how consumer grade 4x4 stacks up against commercial grade 3x3 and see if it's actually that much faster, see if the range is better, see whatever. So with this, we're looking at wireless 2.4 or wireless 5. So it's going to be separate networks, and so it's not exactly an apples to apples comparison. The reason they do that is because some people have devices that are working fine on 5 gigahertz, but if you're on the edge of the range or there's interference, the device might switch to 2.4 gigahertz, which is almost certainly a worse experience than the 5 gigahertz experience because the devices aren't particularly smart about it. So this is the fix from a lot of vendors, is to just separate the networks. It's a little trickier to have networks have the same access point name but operate on two different frequencies and actually have it work correctly. There's some stuff under the hood there that makes that happen, but by and large that's a story for another day. Just be aware that you've got the 2.4 gigahertz name and the 5 gigahertz name is what this is telling me off the bat, and then we can see that it's got a generated password here, which I think is probably a good thing. We can also see that the wireless encryption method is WPA2 AES, which is a very secure protocol indeed. Alright, it looks like we start on the administration menu on the router status page. Let's click on operation mode and see what our options are. Wireless router mode or repeater mode. I think that I would have liked to have seen a access point mode in case you don't necessarily want to use it as a router, because that's probably how I'm going to configure it for my testing. Set password allows you to set the password. Firmware upgrade allows you to check for a firmware upgrade. I'm going to do check and updates. Oh, your firmware is up to date, so I don't have to bother with that. That's cool. There is a way to do it manually. That's neat. Self-healing. So it looks like this feature will reboot the router automatically after a period of time. That's pretty cool for consumer hardware, I guess. I've got routers that have uptimes in the hundreds of days. I think my personal best was about 700 days of continuous uptime for a router. So generally speaking, I would not expect a router to need to be rebooted periodically, but this is a consumer piece of hardware. It is nice that they add the feature to let the router reboot itself periodically. That's one way to deal with things. Sometimes it's not the router's fault, sometimes it's the cable modem or the DSL modem, and it really does help if you just recycle your connection periodically. If you have to reboot your cable modem or your DSL modem periodically, you might try this feature and see if that improves things so that you don't actually have to reboot your cable modem or your DSL modem periodically. Generally speaking, your router should not require reboots periodically. If your router runs out of memory, it's a bug in the operating system on the router. So this just mitigates that if you run into something like that that's weird. Looks like the system log will allow you to see a log of what's going on the system. This looks like a log from Linux. I wonder if the firmware on this thing can be changed. That would probably be a lot of fun. USB application. Alright, so this lets you configure what you're doing with the USB connections. We saw earlier there were two USB connections. So you've got the option for USB storage and USB printing. So if you have a USB printer, you can hook that up to this and print through USB. USB storage server options and the media server. The media server is a DLNA server. I did not have a chance to test that as part of this review. However, this device does have a dual 1.5 gigahertz CPU. It should be okay for streaming. If you have high definition streams or high bitrate streams, I suspect that the CPUs will struggle with that streaming. But if that's something that you guys want to see or you guys are interested in, let me know in the comments and I'll do a test on that. So the firewall options are pretty simplistic. Basically, you've just got firewall on off. You can also do the access block list where you block a particular MAC address. This doesn't really help you for blocking things from the internet. This is more to do with your local LAN. Denial of service protection, you got to take that with a grain of salt, because the reality is that most people's internet connections are just not fast enough that doing any kind of denial of protection mitigation at the router level on your side is going to do anything. Almost certainly it's going to have to be something, done upstream with your ISP. We read about on the internet, it's like, children basically are in control of 150 gigabit botnets. There's nothing you can do about 150 gigabit botnet, distributed denial of service attacking your particular IP address. So there are probably some protections in here for this denial of service protection, but it probably makes sense that it's off, because there's nothing you can do if your connection is flooded, because your connection is not going to be 150 gigabit. Your connection is going to be, 50 megabit, 25 megabit. If you're in Australia, like 2 megabit. Parental control. So this gives you the option of turning the internet on and off according to a schedule, which I guess would maybe be useful if you have kids and you want to control their internet access by time of day. Quality of service. So this is one of the interesting features on this router. At Computex, we had learned that ASRock had partnered with Qualcomm, and the Qualcomm would be supplying gaming information, not really gaming information, but quality of service tables where the router could recognize that certain kinds of games were being played and prioritize that kind of traffic. Now, out of the box, it comes with this on. One of the other things you'll want to do for quality of service is figure out what your bandwidth is. And so you run this test, and you're able to it'll automatically figure out what your uplink and downlink is, or your upload and download capacity on your internet access. And so with that, this thing can say, oh, we're starting to use all of our internet connection, let me reserve some of it for the game. Or, oh, our latency is starting to get really high because we're using most of our available bandwidth. So your ping time would go from 10 or 20 or 50 to like 100 to like 1,000 to like 2,000 when you've maxed out your connection, and it's going to be really bad for gaming. So if somebody's downloading a movie, or somebody's doing BitTorrent or something like that, it can really quickly cripple your connection from a gaming perspective. Well, quality of service, the promise of quality of service is to make it so that those bulk traffic applications like bulk downloading and BitTorrent and things like that don't interfere with gaming by saturating the connection, causing your ping time to go really high. So this thing, in order for it to work, has to know what your bandwidth is. If you're on cable and you get, say you've got a 50 meg cable plan, and your cable connection really is 50 meg most of the time, but about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, everybody's getting home from school, and your 50 meg connection is going to like 10 meg. Quality of service can't really help with that unless you come in here and you key in 10 meg for your upload and download, because your available bandwidth has gone to less than it normally is, and your ping time is probably going to be worse and that sort of thing. So keep that in mind. That's probably a lesson for another day. It doesn't really matter too much for the router. It's just something you got to keep in mind when you're messing with these kind of settings. Now, it looks like as far as this GUI goes, you can set the priority according to IP address and MAC address and whatever, I guess it's recognized the operating system here. It seems like that if the gaming feature, where it's going to recognize certain types of games and prioritize those, is in effect here, I would expect to see a little bit more information about that on this page. I would expect to see it's like, oh, you've got WoW going, or oh, you've got Grand Theft Auto going, or something like that, so that I know that that traffic is being prioritized. I'm not seeing that here in the interface. That's what they told us that it was going to do at Computex, but I don't seem to have a way to verify that that's actually happening. So under the WAN menu, you've got some options for what kind of WAN internet connection you've got. You can set it for DHCP, which is what it's on now, or dynamic, static IP address, PPPoE, PPTP, and layer 2 tunneling protocol. Those are the different kinds of internet connections that are available in the world. I don't see anything missing there. That's really good. You're also able to set the MTU. So sometimes if you're on dial-up and you're doing PPPoE, your MTU is not going to be 1500. It's going to be 1492 or less. So some routers, you can't actually set the MTU, and when that happens, you're in for a bad time. The next option under WAN is port triggering. It does support port triggering. What that means is that, let's say that you've got a couple of different machines on the inside of your network. You're running a port. When your computer inside the network sends traffic to a website on a specific port, that website may expect something to come back. The classic example is FTP. FTP is a hideously dumb, poorly designed protocol, and the data port is actually port 20, I think, if I remember correctly. So you'll connect to an FTP server on port 20, and you'll issue commands, and then the FTP server has to connect back to you. And so that is a kind of port triggering in the context of this router, because it's not normal the way that it works. So network address translation works a little differently than that. Usually the response is set up a little differently than the way that it works with FTP. Because FTP is doing an explicit reconnection back. So if you had a second host that you're running and it's connecting out on port 21, the router has to know, it's like, oh, this computer is having a conversation with that FTP server, and this computer is having a conversation with that FTP server. I see the remote FTP server trying to connect to the router. I need to redirect that traffic to this particular machine inside the LAN. So it's slightly complicated, slightly weird. It doesn't really work all that great with the regular network address translation algorithm, which takes your public IP address, your real public IP address, and converts it into the internal 192.168, or passes the traffic in for the internal 192.168 network. So just keep that in mind. Most of the time, most people will want port forwarding. What port forwarding does is it opens up a port on your public IP address on the public side of your router and forwards it to an internal machine. So unlike with port triggering, where port triggering could have that connection from the public side to an internal machine go to different internal machines depending on which machine initiated the connection, this is a port that's open all the time. And so you can specify the external port range. So like a web server would be port 80, although most ISPs don't like you running a web server. But you could say, service web port range 80 to 80, local IP address, the local 192.168 IP address of your web server, local port 80 again. You don't need to specify UDP for port 80, and actually that's probably asking for trouble, because if somebody, compromises your machine, they could surreptitiously have something running over UDP port 80 and your firewall accidentally forwarded that. But again, it's a story for another day. So you can just say TCP, and that will forward all of traffic to your public IP address on port 80 to an internal IP address. DMZ will forward any unrecognized traffic to an internal IP address. Don't do this unless you know what you're doing. DDNS is dynamic DNS. So if you're going to register dyndns.org, you say that you've got PPPoE or cable mode, you don't have a static IP address. This is a service where the router, whenever your IP address changes, it'll connect to a dynamic DNS service and update whatever your public IP address is, so that you can do a DNS lookup and always get back to your home connection. This is actually really cool if you don't have a dynamic IP address, because let's say that you've got stuff.dyndns.org. Well, no matter what your public IP address is, your router will make sure that stuff.dyndns.org always resolves to your home internet connection. This is a really cool way for connecting back to your home connection from anywhere that you might happen to be. The LAN setting will just let you configure the IP address of the router itself, whether or not you want to use the DHCP server, which hands out IP addresses on your network. And then you can also manually specify a MAC address to IP address mapping. So if you want to use DHCP, but you want to make sure that a printer, if you've got a network printer or a particular computer, always gets a certain IP address, hint, you should make sure that any computers you're forwarding ports on have a manual IP assignment in DHCP, so the IP never changes, because otherwise then the port forward stops working mysteriously and you have to troubleshoot it and figure it out. So with this, you can configure the DHCP server, set it up, and you're good to go. Lease time just means how long the computer uses the IP address before the computer asks the router if it can keep using the IP address or if it has to get a new IP address. So 2880 minutes is a ridiculously long time, so that's probably all right. And then finally, that takes us to our wireless settings. The wireless settings allow you to turn on and off the wireless radio. Looks like there's a schedule for turning the wireless on and off. You can set the wireless channel manually with the drop down. I like auto because generally auto means that it's going to try to find the least congested channel automatically, which is good. Wireless mode, you can do auto in, for 2.4 you can do auto in only or legacy. I'm going to leave that on auto as well. CDS protection, this is clear to send. This is just a protocol setting. The bandwidth, this means that the devices can use 20 or 40 megahertz channels on the 2.4 gigahertz channel. Then you've got broadcast SSID, so if you want a hidden SSID, you would turn this off. A preamble type auto, again, probably just leave it on automatic. RTS threshold 2347, this is when requests to send packets are sent, depending on the amount of data that has to go there. DTM interval, a whole bunch of other things. Transmit power adjustment, I wonder if it'll let me say 150%. Probably not. Should be decimal 1 to 100. So this lets you turn down the power but doesn't let you turn up the power. Yeah, I didn't actually change anything, but it wants me to reboot again. WMM, this is a kind of quality of service on the wireless side. So if you're using multimedia or streaming or something, there are some extensions to wireless. It's like wireless multimedia mode or wireless mixed media or whatever the acronym happens to stand for this week, that has to do with making sure that streaming media clients get the quality of service that they need in order to do streaming. So by and large, you really want this on unless you have a really ancient device that doesn't support it, like a Roku from like 1986, and then you might have to turn it off for troubleshooting purposes, but by and large it should be on. Wireless security, you can set, open means no encryption, WPA2, AES, and then the legacy WPA mixed mode. You definitely probably don't want to use WPA. WPA2 is where it's at in terms of security. Then you can set the password. Interestingly, it does support a radius server. So a radius server lets you do authentication on a per client basis. I would really like to test that out. This router doesn't really have a lot of advanced features, and I'm surprised that they left radius in. That's interesting. Then we have our wireless 5G options. Again, you can control the radio and the schedule and the channel. You can set the SSID, the wireless mode, a whole bunch of other things. It also supports the wireless multimedia quality of service options. You can also set the authentication method and the password. It supports up to 6 guest networks, 3 on each channel. So you can turn this on and set a password for a guest, and you can also set the duration that you want the guest network to last. So I'm not sure, will it let me set 0? Okay, so it will let me set 0 minutes, which I think means that it's going to let me have a guest network that lasts forever. So I'm just going to turn that off. Probably would be good to have some help text or explanation or something like that here that would sort of clue you in to that, but beggars can't be choosers. And then you've got WPS. Now the WPS buttons are on the back. There's one for 2.4 gigahertz and one for 5 gigahertz. You can push the button and get a pin number and go from there. Now this router has the Wi-Fi protected setup buttons to try to make life easier for setting up clients. You can configure whether or not you want it to be in the push button mode, where you just push the button and then the device pairs up, or if you want it to be in client pin mode, where you set a pin ahead of time and then you can use that pin to set up devices with a key. So that's a nice feature in terms of security. And that's pretty much it for the back end. Being the enterprise user that I am, I sort of want more high-end features and more configurability. This doesn't really have a lot of advanced features. That said, it was pretty easy to set up. It was pretty easy to configure. Now, one other thing we could take a quick look at is exactly how the quality of service thing works with this particular router. So we've logged into our web portal here, and we're just going to go to /debug.html. What this actually came about from was I was playing GTA 5 and doing some testing, and GTA 5 does not actually have a policy in the firmware yet for the online play, but a lot of other games do. So I thought this was really neat, and I could show you. You can go to debug.html on this particular router, and it will show you what it's doing as far as quality of service goes. Now, I've started playing, something on YouTube, and there's some stuff that's happening there, and so right now the tag of default is just showing up because we're getting an ad. And so this is letting you know how the router classifies this particular material. But now that we're actually on YouTube proper, you'll see that the actual YouTube tag has popped up. So when you're playing games or doing anything with different types of bandwidth, you can look here and see how this has been tagged. And so if you see your game here, then that means the quality of service should be working right. And if it's not working right, it may actually be a problem with the amount of available bandwidth that you have. And so you should then come to the router configuration and actually go into advanced mode, and then go to quality of service and mess with your uplink and downlink available megabit or your available bandwidth here if you're still having quality of service problems, even though it's detecting something that has been tagged correctly. Now this thing knows that YouTube is bulk traffic, so it's really just going to do quality of service as far as actual gameplay goes and not footage of gameplay. So I just want to be clear about that. So let's talk verdict. What's the conclusion on the ASRock G10 router? Well, first, it's a 4x4 configuration. It actually turned out better than I thought it would. The testing that we did was primarily around having a bunch of different devices, some 2x2, some 3x3, communicating with the ASRock G10. And we put it up against the Ubiquiti AC Pro, which is a 3x3 sort of enterprise grade router. It's not really a fair fight, but it's a pretty good measuring stick. But it's interesting. At shorter ranges, meaning about 150 feet or less, about 100 feet or less, and basically, an open room, The ASRock did better with more devices. At longer ranges, the Ubiquiti did way better, but at shorter ranges, the G10 actually did really well. And I think that's because of the 4x4 configuration. You know, the 4x4 configuration is a little unusual to see on a lot of routers, and I think it's diminishing returns when you do, you know, 4, 5, 6, 7 antennas. And certainly at longer distances, that was true. I mean, if you're going to have 2 3x3 routers, you know, on either end of your house, that's probably going to work out better for you than, you know, one router with 8 antennas. That said, the G10 actually did perform really well. I only used it for about a week, give or take, and not with an insane number of devices. But the grumpiest wireless device that I have is the Microsoft Surface Pro 3. It's got a Marvell Avstar adapter in it for the wireless, and it's bad. There's just no other way to put it. The software is terrible. The hardware locks up all the time. The Bluetooth just craps out. That's a story for another time. That actually worked better on the G10 solution than it does with the Ubiquiti. I'm not sure why. So that was sort of a delight. I was like, gonna have to see if I can't get this at my house now. I don't know. The software on the G10, I really wish that the software was a little bit more complex. If you are, you know, a super tweaker, the software really doesn't give you a lot of options. You can configure this as an access point instead of a standalone router. The GUI wizard thing doesn't like make it easy for you to hit a button to do that. You have to know what you want to do, which is, you know, disable DHCP, set the IP address of the router to be an IP address inside the subnet of whatever network you're plugging it into. You have to know to do those things. You can't just hit a button and let it figure it out, as we've seen on a lot of other routers. The debug page is really awesome, and you should use it if you're going to fart around. The real bell and whistle features on this router is that it can learn infrared and control your home appliances through a mobile application, which is neat, but I didn't really use it that much. That it has a travel router and miracast adapter. For me, honestly, the miracast adapter is not bad. Miracast is too slow to use for wireless gaming, in my opinion, but for presentations and for playing movies, you know, like on a big screen TV wirelessly or something like that, you don't want to do an HDMI connection, you want to stream from your computer or tablet, then the miracast adapter actually works really well. The travel router is a 2x2 travel router. The range on it is pretty limited. So I did not do extensive testing. Basically, I plugged it in. It's like, does it work with the Surface Pro? It's like, yeah, it kind of does. Okay, well, let's do some range testing. Oh, that didn't really work out too well. So for a travel router, I mean, it's a travel router. I can't really fault it for that because it's not really designed for that. It's sort of a 2-in-1 device. And so that's your other bell and whistle. The other bell and whistle, the other main claim to fame of this is that you've got quality of service at the router level. Quality of service at the router level is sort of pre-configured and sort of baked into the firmware. I did have problems with it detecting GTA 5 online, and because of the limited UI, there wasn't really a way for me to set it up myself. But for YouTube and bulk traffic and that kind of thing, it actually did work as it is supposed to. So that's good that it works that way. So overall, the product is better than I expected. It actually works really well. It did not lock up or do anything weird. For what it is, it works pretty well. It's not enterprise grade. It's not, you know, totally bulletproof hardware. It wouldn't look completely out of place in your living room. I like that you can turn the LEDs off so that, you know, if you're watching a movie and you want the only light to come from the television, you know, that's an option if your router's in your living room. I could see having something like this set up if I had an apartment, you know, in like downtown or Soho or something, but it doesn't have enough enterprise features for my particular taste. If you want an easy button router that is basically okay, then this is pretty good. But in order to really test it, in order to really burn and test it, I would have to move several terabytes of information over the wireless and really confirm that it's not going to melt or do anything weird, because you'd be surprised how many routers can't actually pass that test, or how many routers the signal's a lot more noisy when you get done with that test. Overall though, for a consumer grade router, you could do a lot worse. Now this is a Broadcom solution for the chipset internally, but other than that, I didn't really see anything wrong with it on the surface. But if you have one of these, I'm curious what your experience with it is, and you should let me know in the forums over at techsyndicate.com. And if you're thinking about getting one of these, you should head on over to the forums at techsyndicate.com and see what everybody else's experience is with this, and also if I have any updates or anything posted or anything else that we've done. Overall, the 4x4 radios configuration on this G10 does seem to help it a little bit, but only at shorter distances. So if you're doing streaming and somebody else is doing something intense on the wireless, you're going to notice that a lot less, because you've basically got 4 radios in this thing. You know, it does the beam forming and all that sort of thing. So if you've got a house with a lot of wireless clients, more radios is probably better. And the fact that they're in one device means that they're coordinating with one another. If you want that otherwise, you would have to get, you know, something like the Ubiquiti, where you can have 2 access points that are working in tandem with one another, and that's a much better solution than, say, a wireless repeater or something like that. So overall, not bad. So if you've got one of these, I'm curious what your experiences are. Head on over to the forums at techsyndicate.com and let me know. If you're thinking about getting one of these, head on over to the forums and let us know what your thoughts are, or let us know what your questions are. And you may be able to connect with people that already have one, so you guys can share ideas and feedback and thoughts and that sort of thing. I'm Wendell, and I'll see you in the forums.